Let me tell you about the hardest thing I have ever witnessed. Not the hardest thing I have ever done, the hardest thing I have ever watched another person do. I am 24 years old. I am a volunteer hospice aide. And for 11 weeks, I sat beside a dying woman who had spent 40 years making people homeless, including my grandmother. I knew who Hazel Beaumont was before I walked into her room. I had known since I was 9 years old, sitting in my grandmother's kitchen in a house that was not her house anymore, watching her fold her hands on a table that was not her table anymore, in a neighborhood that had been hers for 40 years and was no longer. I knew, and I walked in anyway, not because I had forgiven her, not because I had forgotten, because my grandmother raised me to understand something that I have spent my whole life trying to live up to, that the way you treat people who have hurt you is the truest measure of who you are. Not the way you treat people who have been kind to you, the way you treat the ones who weren't. My name is Wren Calloway. I am 24 years old. And what happened in that room over 11 weeks is the story I am still learning to understand. My name is Wren Calloway. I am 24 years old. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. Not the Savannah of the tourist photographs, not the squares and the Spanish moss and the antebellum houses that people come from elsewhere to see. The Savannah of the neighborhoods west of downtown. The Savannah that is older than its postcard version and less curated and more honest about what the city actually is. My grandmother's name was Opal Calloway. She was 71 years old when I was 9. She had lived in the same house in the Keeler-Brownville neighborhood for 42 years, a house that my grandfather and I had bought in 1961, the year of my grandfather's first real paycheck from the Savannah Port Authority, the house where my mother was born and her brother, and the specific life of a family that has been in one place long enough to be part of it. The house had a garden. My grandmother's garden was, I want to be precise about this because it matters for the story, not decorative. It was functional in the specific way of gardens kept by women who grew up in a time and place where growing food was not a hobby. Collards, sweet potatoes, okra, tomatoes in the summer when Savannah summer makes everything insistent and green and slightly overwhelming. She tended it every morning, before the heat. When I was small, I sat on the back steps and watched her, and she talked to me about the plants like some grandmothers talk to grandchildren about stories, with the specific attention of someone passing something on. I was 9 when Hazel Beaumont's lawyers came. I need to tell you about Hazel Beaumont, not the version of her that arrived at the end, diminished, alone, the specific final accounting of a life lived in a particular way, the version that existed at her height. Hazel Beaumont was 68 years old when I walked into her hospital room. She had been, for 40 decades, one of the most effective real estate operators in coastal Georgia. Effective in the specific sense of someone who understood exactly how to use legal mechanisms to accomplish outcomes that were individually defensible and that accumulated over time into something that was not. She was not a criminal. This is important to understand. Everything Hazel Beaumont did was legal. She hired the best property attorneys in Savannah. She understood tax law and lien law and the specific vulnerabilities of people who own property but cannot afford to defend it in court. She understood that a legal process applied with sufficient patience and sufficient resources can produce outcomes that no individual action in the process would appear to justify. She was very good at this. Over 40 years, she had acquired approximately 200 properties in the coastal Georgia region. Some of these were straightforward commercial transactions. Some were not. My grandmother's house was not. The specific mechanism, I have had 40 years of my family's understanding of it, and I have also, as an adult, read the actual court documents because I needed to understand what had actually happened rather than what had felt like it happened. The specific mechanism was a property tax lien. My grandfather had died in 1989. My grandmother, at 62, managing, alone, had missed 2 property tax payments. Not because she didn't have the money, because she didn't know she needed to pay them separately. My grandfather had always handled it. She had not understood it was due. By the time she understood, the lien had been filed. Hazel Beaumont's company purchased the lien within 30 days. The legal process that followed was individually correct at every step. The outcome was that my grandmother lost a house she had lived in for 42 years for a tax debt of $2,300. She moved into my mother's apartment. She never had a garden again. She died at 79, without a garden. I became a hospice volunteer at 22. Not because of Hazel Beaumont. I did not know when I started that she would eventually be assigned to me. I became a hospice volunteer because my grandmother's death, when I was 19, had been not bad, not frightening, but alone in a way that troubled me. She had died in a hospital room with my mother and me present, which is not alone in the literal sense, but with the specific quality of someone who had been displaced from her life and had never fully resettled. I did not want other people to die that way. That is the simple version of why I started. The more complicated version is that I had been looking since I was 9 years old for something I could do with what had happened to my grandmother that was not simply carrying it. Hospice work gave me something to do with it. I trained for 6 months. I worked with 17 patients over 2 years before Hazel Beaumont. And then, on a Tuesday morning in March, my coordinator called me. "Wren," she said, "I have an assignment I want to talk to you about before I put it in the system. I want you to have the choice." "Okay," I said. "The patient's name is Hazel Beaumont," she said. 68 years old. Pancreatic cancer, late stage. She has no family present, no visitors. She'll need consistent coverage." I was quiet for a moment. "I know that name," I said. "I know you do," my coordinator said. "That's why I'm calling instead of just assigning. You don't have to take this one." I thought about my grandmother's kitchen, the folded hands, the table that was not her table anymore. "I'll take it," I said. I want to tell you about walking into Hazel Beaumont's room for the first time. Not what I felt, what I saw. The room was private. She had money, and money means a private room even at the end. It was the specific quality of a room that has been made as comfortable as a situation allows, which is a kind of comfort that has a ceiling. She was smaller than I expected. I do not know why I expected her to be large. Perhaps because the things she had done were large, because something that had occupied so much space in my family's story for 15 years seemed to have a proportionate physical presence. She was small, white hair, thin now against the pillow, skin that had the specific quality of someone who had spent decades in the Georgia sun and was now, in the interior light of a hospital room, revealing what was underneath. Sharp eyes, still sharp, which I had not expected either. The specific intelligence of someone whose mind had not gone as the body had. She looked at me when I came in. She looked at me for a long time. "You're the volunteer," she said. "Yes," I said. "My name is Wren Calloway." Something happened in her face when I said my last name. A very small thing. There and gone. "Calloway," she said. "Yes," I said. We looked at each other. She knew. I knew. "Are you going to be able to do this?" she said. Her voice was direct in the way of someone who has been direct their entire life and sees no reason to stop now. "Yes," I said. "Why?" she said. I thought about my grandmother, about what she would have said. Because it's the right thing to do, I said. She looked at me for a long time. Sit down, she said. I sat. I sat with Hazel Beaumont for the first time on a Tuesday in March. I came back on Thursday and Saturday and the following Tuesday, the rhythm of hospice work, the specific, patient, unhurried rhythm of sitting with someone who is at the end of something and who needs more than almost anything else, a consistent presence. I brought things, not because the protocol required it, because I am someone who brings things, who learned from my grandmother that arriving at someone's home or someone's bedside with empty hands is a small unkindness. I brought books sometimes. I brought the specific kind of tea that Savannah Mornings suggested. Once, in the third week, I brought a small pot of herbs from my apartment windowsill, basil, which was doing better than expected, because the room had no plants, and rooms without plants have a quality that I find difficult. She looked at the basil for a long time. You grow things, she said. I'm learning, I said. My grandmother was the one who grew things. A pause. Opal Calloway, she said. Not a question. Yes, I said. The room was very quiet. She grew collards, Hazel said. I saw the garden once when we were doing the property inspection. The property inspection. My grandmother's property. The house she lost for $2,300. Yes, I said. She grew collards. Neither of us said anything for a while. The basil sat on the windowsill. The second week was when Hazel started talking. Not about the properties, not about my grandmother specifically, about her life. In the specific way of dying people who have arrived at the point where the constructed version of the self, the version maintained for an audience, the version that served a purpose, has become too heavy to hold. She talked about growing up. She had grown up poor. This is the thing that surprised me most in the second week, sitting in that room, that Hazel Beaumont had grown up in circumstances that were not far from the circumstances of many of the people whose land she had eventually taken. A small house in Thunderbolt, the fishing community east of Savannah, a father who worked the shrimp boats, a mother who cleaned houses. The specific material poverty of coastal Georgia in the 1960s, which was not dramatic, but it was constant, and was shaped by the specific knowledge that nothing you had was entirely secure. I decided when I was 12 that I was never going to lose anything, she said one morning. She said it with the matter-of-fact quality of someone stating a decision that seemed at the time it was made entirely logical. 12 is very young to make that kind of decision, I said. Yes, she said. A pause. Did it work? I said. Not losing anything? She looked out the window. The Georgia morning outside. The specific quality of Savannah light that is different from anywhere else, filtered through old trees, heavy with the proximity of water. I'm sorry, she said. I looked at her. 2 words, said without the specific performance of apology, without the inflation that apologies sometimes get when the person saying them is trying to feel better rather than to acknowledge something true. Just 2 words, flat and honest. I know, I said. The fourth week was the hardest, not because of anything said, because of what I started to understand about what I was doing and what it was costing me. I want to be honest about this because I think people have an idea that forgiveness or mercy or whatever you want to call what I was doing in that room is an easy thing, a noble thing, certainly, but easy, as if the choosing of it makes the doing of it simple. It is not simple. There were mornings when I drove to the hospital and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before going in. There were afternoons when I watched Hazel sleeping and felt something that was not mercy at all, but its opposite, the specific hot opposite, and had to sit with it and not let it be the thing that determined what I did next. There was one evening, the fourth week, a Wednesday, when Hazel was having a bad night, and she reached for my hand in the dark, and I held it, and I sat there holding the hand of the woman who had taken my grandmother's house, and I thought, this is the hardest thing I have ever done. Not the hardest thing I have witnessed, the hardest thing I have done. And I stayed. Because my grandmother had raised me to understand something, and because the measure of that understanding was exactly this, not the easy moments, but the hard ones. I stayed. The second week was when Hazel started talking. Not about the properties, not about my grandmother specifically, about her life. In the specific way of dying people who have arrived at the point where the constructed version of the self, the version maintained for an audience, the version that served a purpose, has become too heavy to hold. She talked about growing up. She had grown up poor. This is the thing that surprised me most in the second week, sitting in that room, that Hazel Beaumont had grown up in circumstances that were not far from the circumstances of many of the people whose land she had eventually taken. A small house in Thunderbolt, the fishing community east of Savannah, a father who worked the shrimp boats, a mother who cleaned houses. The specific material poverty of coastal Georgia in the 1960s, which was not dramatic, but it was constant, and was shaped by the specific knowledge that nothing you had was entirely secure. I decided when I was 12 that I was never going to lose anything, she said one morning. She said it with the matter-of-fact quality of someone stating a decision that seemed at the time it was made entirely logical. 12 is very young to make that kind of decision, I said. Yes, she said. A pause. Did it work? I said. Not losing anything? She looked out the window. The Georgia morning outside. The specific quality of Savannah light that is different from anywhere else, filtered through old trees, heavy with the proximity of water. I'm sorry, she said. I looked at her. 2 words. Said without the specific performance of apology, without the inflation that apologies sometimes get when the person saying them is trying to feel better rather than to acknowledge something true. Just 2 words, flat and honest. I know, I said. The 4th week was the hardest, not because of anything said, because of what I started to understand about what I was doing and what it was costing me. I want to be honest about this because I think people have an idea that forgiveness or mercy or whatever you want to call what I was doing in that room is an easy thing, a noble thing, certainly, but easy, as if the choosing of it makes the doing of it simple. It is not simple. There were mornings when I drove to the hospital and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before going in. There were afternoons when I watched Hazel sleeping and felt something that was not mercy at all, but its opposite, the specific hot opposite, and had to sit with it and not let it be the thing that determined what I did next. There was one evening, the 4th week, a Wednesday, when Hazel was having a bad night, and she reached for my hand in the dark, and I held it. And I sat there holding the hand of the woman who had taken my grandmother's house, and I thought, this is the hardest thing I have ever done. Not the hardest thing I have witnessed, the hardest thing I have done. And I stayed. Because my grandmother had raised me to understand something, and because the measure of that understanding was exactly this, not the easy moments, but the hard ones. I stayed. Hazel told me about the other families in the 5th week. Not prompted. I had not asked, would not have put her in the position of confessing to me what she had done as if I were a priest in the room of confessional. She told me because she needed to say it. To someone. To the one person in the room. She told me about the Hendersons, a family in Liberty County who had farmed the same land since before the Civil War. She told me about the Martins in Bryan County, an elderly couple whose son was in prison when the lien was filed and who had no one to help them navigate the process. She told me about the Washingtons in Effingham County, a family I had not known about, whose story was almost identical to my grandmother's, except that the grandmother in that family had died the year after losing the property, and the family believed it was the grief that had done it. She told me all of it. I listened to all of it. When she finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Why are you telling me this?" I said. "Because you're the only one who's here," she said. and because you deserve to know the full size of it. Do you want me to say something? I said. No, she said. I want you to know. That's different. I thought about that. Okay, I said. I know. She looked at the basil on the windowsill. It had been growing, slowly, in the hospital light, but growing. Your grandmother, she said. What was she like? I thought about how to answer. She talked to her plants, I said. She said they grew better if you talked to them. I don't know if that's true. It might be, Hazel said. She made the best biscuits in Savannah, I said. She would have disputed that characterization because she was modest, but she was wrong. Hazel almost smiled. The first time. In 5 weeks. Almost. She sounds like someone I would have liked, Hazel said. I looked at her. She would have liked you too, I said. That was the problem with her. She liked almost everyone. In the 6th week, Hazel asked me something directly, the most direct thing she had asked. She had been awake since early morning. The pain was being managed, but the imperfection meant long wakeful hours in the specific gray pre-dawn of a hospital room. I was there. I had brought tea. We had been sitting in the near dark, not talking, which was something we had learned to do, the specific, comfortable silence of two people who have been in a room together long enough that silence does not require filling. And then, why didn't you refuse the assignment? She said. I looked at her. My coordinator gave me the choice, she said. You said yes. I want to know why. I thought about it. Honestly. Because my grandmother wouldn't have refused it, I said. That's not a reason. That's an inheritance. Yes, it is. She was quiet. Opal Calloway raised you, she said. Partly, I said. Enough. Then she's in this room, whether she means to be or not. I thought about that. Yes, I said. I think she is. Hazel looked at the basil. I think that might be the worst thing, she said quietly. That she's the one who sent someone to sit with me. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say. She was right. In the 7th week, Hazel's attorney came. A man named Gerald Fitch, 60, silver-haired, the specific appearance of a man who has spent 40 years in property law and has developed the professional neutrality of someone who has done things he does not think about too carefully. He came on a Wednesday afternoon. I was present for the beginning of the meeting. Hazel asked me to stay, which surprised me, and I stayed until she said I could go. What I understood of what was discussed, Hazel was revising her estate documents. What she was revising them to say, she did not tell me that day. Gerald Fitch left at 4 o'clock. Hazel was tired afterward, the kind of tired that is bone deep, the kind that the body produces when it has been asked to do something significant. I brought water. I sat. You didn't have to stay, she said. You asked me to, I said. I didn't want to be alone with him, she said. Gerald Fitch, I said. I've known him for 30 years. He's done everything I've asked him to do. Every lien purchase, every legal process. He never questioned any of it. And now, I said, now I'm asking him to do something different. She did not tell me what. Not that day. The 8th week. Hazel's bad nights were more frequent. I had adjusted my schedule to cover more evening hours, something my coordinator had noted with the specific careful attention of someone who monitors their volunteers for signs of overextension. You're putting in a lot of hours on this one, she said. I know, I said. Are you okay? I thought about it honestly. I don't know, I said, but I'm going to finish it. She looked at me for a moment. When, she said, you know you can't fix what she did. I know, I said. Then what are you doing? I thought about my grandmother, about the kitchen, about the folded hands on a table that was not her table, about what she had taught me in the specific way of grandmothers who teach without appearing to teach, about what it means to be a person in the world. I'm being the kind of person my grandmother raised me to be, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. My coordinator was quiet for a moment. "She must have been extraordinary," she said. "She was," I said. "She grew collards." In the 10th week, Hazel told me what she had changed in the estate documents. Not all of it. I think some of it was still being finalized, still being decided in the specific slow way of decisions made at the end of a life when every choice carries more weight than it did before. But the part that was mine to know. "The Henderson property in Liberty County," she said. "I'm returning it to the family. Whatever I can return, it's complicated legally. Some of it has changed hands since, but what can be returned will be." I looked at her. "The Martins in Bryan County, a settlement through the estate. Gerald is working out the amount." "Hazel, I'm not asking for your approval or your absolution. I'm telling you what I'm doing." "Okay," I said. "Your grandmother's house," she said. "That one I can't give back. It's been sold twice since, but there's money in the estate. I'm telling Gerald to find the Calloway family." I was very still. "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't have to. That's the point." She looked at the basil, still growing. "She talked to her plants," she said. "Yes," I said. "Do you?" "I'm learning," I said. Something happened in Hazel's face. Not a smile. Something deeper than a smile. The specific expression of someone who is too tired for a performance, and what is left is simply true. "Will you talk to this one, the basil, while it's here?" I looked at the small pot on the windowsill. "Yes," I said. "Good," she said. "I think it needs it." Hazel Beaumont died on a Thursday morning in June. Early. The specific early morning hour when things end quietly, when the city is not yet fully awake, and the light is the color of something beginning rather than ending. I was there. I had been there since 11 the night before, not because anyone called me, because I knew. The specific knowledge of someone who has been present through 11 weeks and learned to read the signs. I held her hand. She was not conscious, or not in the way that consciousness usually presents, but she was breathing. And then she wasn't. I sat with her for a while after, not because the protocol required it, because she had no one else, because a person who has died deserves to not be immediately alone, regardless of what they did when they're living. I thought about my grandmother, about the kitchen, about the folded hands, about what she would have said if I could have called her from that room and told her what I was doing. I think she would have said, "Good." Not, "I'm proud of you," not, "You did the right thing," just, "Good." The specific affirmation of someone who had already known that this was what I would do given the chance. Good. I left the hospital at 8 in the morning. I drove home. I talked to the basil on my windowsill. Gerald Fitch called me 3 weeks after Hazel died. Not me specifically at first. He had contacted my mother, and my mother had called me. "There's something from the Beaumont estate, Gerald Fitch's office. He wants to meet." We met the following week. Gerald Fitch's office was on Bull Street, the specific Savannah geography of old money and old law, buildings that have been offices since before anyone living was born. He was professional, careful. He said, "Miss Beaumont left specific instructions regarding the Calloway family. She was very precise about her intentions." He told us what the instructions were. I will not tell you the specific amount. It belongs to my mother and to the memory of my grandmother, and it is not mine to share with a number attached to it. What I will tell you is what Hazel had written in the instructions. Gerald read it directly from the document. In recognition of a wrong that cannot be undone, but must be acknowledged, the property at Coulier Brownville taken from Opal Calloway in 1994 through the legal mechanism of a tax lien, I direct this sum to Opal Calloway's living descendants as partial restitution. This is not settlement. This is not absolution. This is acknowledgement. There is a difference. My mother looked at me. I looked at the document. She wrote that herself, Gerald said. She was very precise that it not be legal language. She said she wanted it to sound like something a person said, not something a lawyer wrote. I thought about Hazel, about 11 weeks, about a basil plant on a hospital windowsill, about the hardest thing I have ever done. I do think it does, I said. It sounds like something a person said. I planted a garden in the spring. Not in a hospital room. In the small backyard of the house I rent in Coulier Brownville, the neighborhood my grandmother was from, the neighborhood I moved to 2 years ago, partly by accident and partly by the specific gravity of people who are drawn back to the places that shaped the people who shaped them. Collards, sweet potatoes, okra, tomatoes because summer insists on it. The garden is not as good as my grandmother's. It will not be for a long time. You do not learn a garden in a season. You learn it over years in the specific slow way of understanding what a particular patch of soil wants and doesn't, what the light does in the morning versus the afternoon, when to water and when not to. I am learning. Every morning before the heat, I talk to the plants. I do not know if it helps. My grandmother said it did. That is enough for me. My mother and I have talked about Hazel many times since the estate. Not always comfortably. My mother is a more honest person than most about the complicated feelings she has about the situation, about money that came from someone who had done wrong, about what to do with restitution that is, as Hazel's instructions said, not settlement and not absolution. "Are you glad you did it?" my mother asked me once. I thought about it, honestly. I said, "I'm glad I'm the kind of person that did it. That's not the same as glad, but it's something." "She suffered," my mother said, "at the end." "Yes," I said. "Do you think that's karma?" I thought about Hazel, about the specific nature of what the 11 weeks had produced, not for me, for her. The specific weight of being shown mercy by the person you had wronged at the moment when you were most defenseless, when your own assessment of yourself was at its most clear. "I think," I said slowly, "that the hardest thing Hazel experienced in those 11 weeks was not the pain. The pain was managed. The hardest thing was being reminded every time I came in that room of who she could have been." My mother looked at me. "The girl from Thunderbolt," I said, "the daughter of the shrimp boat worker, the one who decided at 12 she was never going to lose anything. She made that decision because she was afraid, and she spent 40 years so busy not losing things that she never noticed what she was giving up. And then you came in the room," my mother said. "And then I came in the room, and I brought basil, and I talked about grandmother's collards, and she understood, I think. She understood what she had traded away. Not the properties, not the money, the other thing, the thing that grandmother had and kept even when she lost the house." "What thing?" my mother said. "The ability to be at peace with the people around her, the ability to be good to people, even when it costs something." My mother was quiet for a while. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said. "I know," I said. "She would also say I should thin the collards. She always said I plant too close together." My mother laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and true. "She would," my mother said. "She absolutely would." The Henderson family got their land back in August. I know this because Gerald Fitch sent a brief note. Professional, careful, the specific register of a man who was doing something he recognizes is unusual and is being very precise about it. The land was transferred, the family had been notified, the legal process which had taken the land had now returned it. I do not know the Hendersons. I have thought about driving out to Liberty County, to the land that was returned. I have not done it. Some things belong to the people they belong to. The land belongs to the Hendersons. My grandmother's house belongs, legally, to whoever has it now, with the white fence. What belongs to me is the garden in Kyler Brownville and the basil on my windowsill, which is doing very well this year. People ask me sometimes what I learned from the 11 weeks. They expect, I think, something about forgiveness, something clean and resolved, the specific moral of a story that has been organized to produce one. What I actually learned is harder to summarize. I learned that mercy is not the absence of anger. It is what you do instead of acting on the anger. I was angry in that room many times. I stayed anyway. Not because the anger was wrong, because the staying was more important than the anger. I learned that people are not their worst acts. Not entirely. Hazel Beaumont was the woman who took my grandmother's house and dozens of others. She was also the girl from Thunderbolt who was afraid since she was 12 years old. Both were true. The bothness does not excuse the wrong, but it explains something. And understanding something, I have found, is more useful than simply condemning it. I learned that my grandmother gave me was not a house. Houses can be taken. Property law is real and consequential, and what Hazel did was wrong, and the mechanism that allowed it to be done is a mechanism that still exists and that still works in the same way. My grandmother knew this. She had lost a house, and she knew exactly what had happened, and she rebuilt a life without the house, and she raised a daughter who raised me in a way that put me in a hospital room in Savannah, Georgia, on a Tuesday morning with a pot of basil and a choice about what kind of person to be. What she gave me was the choice, the specific freedom to be good when being good is hard. That cannot be taken. That does not have a lien mechanism. That is mine. That's the whole story, or the part I'm ready to tell. I want to say something about land, about the specific, powerful human attachment to a piece of earth, to the soil where your family grew things, where your grandfather came home from work, where the collards came up every year close enough to the sidewalk that the neighbors could smell them cooking. Land is not abstract. Land is the place where you are from, and taking it from people through whatever mechanism, however legal, however defensible in individual steps, is not an abstract wrong. It is a specific, physical, generational wrong. Hazel Beaumont knew this. At the end, in the room with the basil and the specific honesty of a woman who could no longer maintain the performance of her choices, she knew it. She said so. This is acknowledgement. There is a difference. She was right. There is a difference between acknowledgement and absolution. Acknowledgement is honest. Absolution is a gift. I did not give Hazel absolution. I gave her presence. I gave her basil and tea and the name of my grandmother's collards and the specific mercy of a person who has decided that being good is more important than being vindicated. My grandmother gave me that decision. It was the most valuable thing she ever gave me. More valuable than the house. More valuable than the land. More valuable than anything Hazel Beaumont could have taken, and anything Hazel Beaumont could have returned. I am still learning to garden. The collards are coming in. I talk to them in the morning before the heat. I don't know if it helps. My grandmother said it did. I believe her.